What's up everyone, True Techno Gamer here, and welcome back to the channel. Now for this video, I got a good one in store for you, because you're going to come away from this video not only learning something new, but really being an expert that you can just show off to your friends about your vast knowledge in video game and computer technology. You may have heard, if you follow gaming at all, a overused term from the likes of Microsoft and Sony and Nvidia and AMD and their PR machines and their marketing. You might have heard this term, you know what I'm about to say. The teraflop, the TFLOP. Xbox One X has 6 teraflops. PlayStation 4 Pro has 4.2 teraflops. Nvidia's RTX 2080 has 10 teraflops, etc., etc. But what is a teraflop? And why are they using this as a term to try to quantify performance? What are the pitfalls of using that term to quantify performance? And what can we actually learn to estimate the performance of future systems like the next generation consoles and the next generation of GPUs? The teraflop, we're about to break it down and you're about to be an expert. Now, you guys ready for the crash course? What is a teraflop? And we're going to break it down. I'm going to show you how you should use it as a benchmark and as a metric, and what's really important about it. What's really important to take away when you hear these terms and these numbers thrown around for a teraflop. But first, let's take a step back and let's just understand what a teraflop is. Now, I mentioned this in an earlier video, but just to recap, a teraflop in and of itself is an acronym, right? It stands for trillion floating point operations per second. Okay, now the tera part, yes, for you math people may know that it's just a binary prefix, right? Similar to how we have kilo and mega and giga, right? And as you may know, kilo is 1,000, 10 to the 3, 1,000, mega, million, giga, billion, tera, trillion. Okay, so in 2020, most gaming platforms that we have available today, commercially available today, we're at the tera level, right? We're at the trillion number of floating point operations. So these are pretty powerful machines. This teraflop nowadays is used primarily as a metric to quantify specifically GPUs, right? So the graphics processors. And there's a reason for that I'll explain. But primarily for GPUs, primarily for, you might hear it used in terms of like a console, a PlayStation, an Xbox, and they do that because they're mostly concerned about the performance of the graphics, right? How much graphics power does the console have? How realistic can the graphics get? You also need to understand that there are different metrics for teraflops, okay? So when you just hear the term teraflop, by itself, it doesn't really tell you the full story, okay? There are primarily 2 types of ways to define a teraflop, or a flop in general, and it's based on the precision, right, of the actual data. There's 16-bit, there's 32-bit, and then there's 64-bit, okay? And when you hear the term teraflop and you hear stuff like the Xbox One X has 6 teraflops, they never say this, but implicit in that metric is the fact that they're talking about what's called single precision, which means the 32-bit teraflop, okay? The 16-bit would correspond to half precision, and the 64-bit would be what's called double precision. Now, the reason why they don't tell you that detail, besides the fact that it's kind of really nerdy and geeky and most people wouldn't understand it, is that for gaming, the most important number out of those 3 is the single precision, because that's the most used number, right? It turns out that most of the data that's used by a graphics card to render games and visuals in today's games is using single precision floating point numbers. So the single precision floating point metric is the most important one. The double precision, just for reference, is used primarily for what's called HPC, or high performance computing apps. Those apps that are churning away at like really long, complicated algorithms for an extended period of time. Now that we know what a teraflop fundamentally is and why it's used, which one is used primarily for gaming, let's take a look at the hierarchy, an example of some of the graphics cards that are out there that you can get for your PC today. Now, this list is actually a bit outdated. I couldn't find one that reflects kind of like the most current list of graphics cards, but this is just to give you an idea. So if you look at the top, the cards that don't say Radeon are made by Nvidia. The Radeon ones are made by AMD. And you kind of get a feel. You see, and notice that it says the floating point 32, floating point 64 gigaflops. Okay, so gigaflops again is billion. So when you see 13,800 gigaflops for the Titan V, that figure really means 13.8 teraflops, right? So this is just some perspective, just to give you an idea of where we're at. AMD's Radeon RX 60 Vega 64, as you see there, in terms of single precision 32, is 12.7 teraflops. Okay. Now, the interesting thing to note here is the relationship and that ratio between the single precision 32-bit and the double precision 64-bit. Now, notice that the Titan V actually has a 1:2 ratio, where the double precision is actually still pretty high at 6.9 teraflops. It's really high for double precision. But you look down and you see things like the RX Vega 64 and even the GTX 1080 Ti. Look at that. That ratio now is 1/16, 1/32, and the double precision number is way lower. Now the reason for that is what I mentioned earlier, that most games today use single precision in their computation, and double precision really isn't as used as much, so it's not as important. So when you look at those graphics cards that are really truly designed for gaming, you're gonna see a much lower double precision number, and that's just a way to keep the actual chip and the die size down on the actual graphics card. So now that we understand what a flop is, a teraflop as well, let's go back and look at the history of how this metric has been used to quantify game performance, right, and system performance. So here's a handy table, and in it you can kind of see the flop measurement for pretty much every console from now back to the Sega Dreamcast, which by the way is my favorite console ever. That's another video though. So it goes back to 1998, and the reason why it's going back to 1998 is just because even though obviously flops existed in some form, we had mega flops and killer flops going back to like the original PlayStation and the N64, etc. It really wasn't used and really reported as a metric for marketing or PR or comparisons up until about the Dreamcast, right? Kind of once the Dreamcast was the first system to pass the gigaflop measurement. If you look here, yeah, you can kind of see the evolution. So, roughly 20 years ago, now I guess, more like 22 years ago, with the Sega Dreamcast, we were at 1.4 gigaflops, okay? 1.4 billion flops. And now, 22 years later, with the Xbox One X, actually not quite 22 years, but 19 years later, we're at 6 trillion flops, right? 6 teraflops. So now, the interesting thing that I also wanted to highlight here is IGN, shout out to IGN. They did a lot of this work for me. They created these cool little visuals that show the evolution of game console hardware for PlayStation and for Xbox based on the flop count, right? And what's cool about it is that if you ever had a doubt of what the law of diminishing returns really is, it is absolutely captured in this chart, right? So if you look back, and they only go back to the PlayStation 2 and then the original Xbox in the early 2000s, right? But if you look back at the PlayStation 2, as you see here, the PlayStation 2 was 6.2 gigaflops, right? And the PlayStation 3, as you see, was 400 gigaflops. So that's a difference of like 64 and a half, almost 65x. In other words, the PlayStation 3 was 65 times more powerful, theoretically, in terms of its graphics processing power than the PlayStation 2. 65 times, okay? Now, look at the chart below that. The PlayStation 4 is 1.8 teraflops, right? 1.8 trillion teraflops. Coming from 400 gigaflops, that's only a difference of about 4.5, right? So the PlayStation 4 is only 4.5 times the graphics processing power than the PlayStation 3. And in the PlayStation 4 Pro, which isn't really a new generation, we get it, they're just showing it here, but just to give you an idea, 3 years after the PlayStation 4, we only got 2.25, right? Roughly 2.25 times the amount of power, right? And we see the same kind of thing for the Xbox, okay? We go back, the original Xbox, which was the most powerful console of that generation, in terms of its gigaflop count, we're looking at about 6 gigaflops, right? And then the Xbox 360 had 240 gigaflops. Now that's a difference of 41, right? So 41 times the Xbox was the graphics horsepower in the Xbox 360. But then again, going from the Xbox 360 to the Xbox One, we only see a 5.45, a 5x, right? And similarly for the Xbox One X, because the Xbox One was so underpowered, relatively speaking, when it came out, and the fact that the Xbox One X came out later than the PlayStation 4 Pro by a year, and Microsoft really wanted to kind of, claim the performance crown and regain some of that mind share they lost. They really went all out with the Xbox One X. So the Xbox One X at 6 teraflops is 4.5 times. But look at that. That's almost the difference between the 360 and the Xbox One original, right? But it's still like 4 or 5x, right? Compared to the 40x, on the 360 over the Xbox, and the 60, the 64x or 65x almost of the PlayStation 3 over the PlayStation 2. Right, now that's the law of diminishing returns in effect, okay? And now we're getting all caught up when we think about, now we know that the Xbox Series X is 12 teraflops. Well, 12 teraflops over the Xbox One X, which is 3 years old, again, that's only 2x, right? Now, even compared to the original Xbox One, now that's a much more meaningful jump. That's about 9x over the original Xbox One to the Series X, or 12 teraflops. Now that's pretty meaningful. Roughly 10x is a pretty nice generational jump, but it still pales in comparison to what we used to see. Here is the key that I want you to take away from this session, so to speak, on teraflops. Understanding efficiency. Now, the actual number of a teraflop is in and of itself pretty meaningless in terms of telling you what the actual performance will be when running a game. How fast can that graphics card process the information, right? How many effects can it do? What's the frame rate can it be? And what resolution can it push at that frame rate? You can't get that just from the teraflop. There's a whole bunch of other components and parameters on any kind of computer system and any kind of gaming system that's going to play into the performance besides just the theoretical teraflop, right? Things like the memory bandwidth, which is kind of like the size of the actual memory pipeline in terms of how much data can flow through it. Is a huge factor in terms of performance. Even the CPU speed, right? Because you got to kind of have a balanced system. If the CPU is underpowered compared to the GPU, because ultimately how stuff works is that the CPU has to feed the actual draw commands to the GPU. The CPU tells the GPU what needs to be drawn to the screen, essentially, right? If the CPU can't feed the GPU fast enough, then the GPU is going to be bottlenecked. You can have the most powerful GPU in the world. If you put this little CPU, it can't feed it, right? It can't keep it occupied, and it's going to be underpowered and it's going to underperform. So the CPU needs to be powerful as well, and that has a big effect on things like frame rate. Even like the I/O, streaming things to the hard drive and back, could bottleneck the entire system. The thermals, what kind of case and how much cooling do you have? That also plays a significant part in terms of how big the GPU can be and ultimately how efficient it can be. Of course, the software driver. So the actual driver is the software, the code that runs on the system. The actual whether it's the game console or Windows in the PC space, and that kind of controls the communication between the actual hardware and the operating system, and that kind of manages how the hardware is used, right? So the driver is supremely important in terms of dictating performance as well. And then of course you have the architecture and the architectural efficiency of the actual hardware, right? So teraflops is a theoretical maximum performance ceiling, and it's calculated based on the clock speed, which can vary, of course, and the number of actual worker units, right, or shader cores in most GPU talk, right? So basically, you take the number of shading and number of actual worker units you have in the hardware, and you multiply it by the actual clock speed, right? With the clock speed is the number that says, well, here's the frequency, here's how fast, how many operations are we doing per second, okay? And it's literally, kind of like the clock speed. It's the speed at which the actual, chip is going to run at. Now you can increase that, and ultimately you're going to increase your performance. And if you decrease it, you're going to decrease your performance, right? So that number can fluctuate, but ultimately that's what it is. So it just says if you maximize the number of operations that the system can do theoretically per second, and the actual number of units it has to work with, then you get the theoretical number. That's a teraflop. Okay. But in the real world, a graphics card is never utilized 100%. Like a lot of things in life, right? You never get 100% utilization, 100% efficiency out of it at all times, right? So you have something like a 2080 Ti on a PC. There's a lot of things that reduce efficiency, right? Again, the driver, the operating system, the other system components, the CPU that is paired with, whatever. So you can take the same exact GPU, a 2080 Ti, and you put it in one system that has an old, Intel Core i3 system from 2014, and you put it in a brand new system that has a Core i9, right, Extreme or something. The same GPU is going to perform a lot better on the system with the Core i9 in general terms, because the CPU is so much faster. So again, it can help feed it better. For example, again, you can put it in one system, like you can put the same GPU in a desktop in a case with liquid cooling and all this stuff, and you can increase the clock speed and get it more performance. And if you had to take that same GPU and put it in a console or a laptop, you have to trim a lot of stuff down to make it fit, right? Just physically, so that it can fit, and that it, also that it won't generate so much heat that you can actually keep it cool, because there's in a smaller platform, there's less room for air to flow. So these kind of things dictate how much utilization and efficiency you can get out of that hardware, okay? But also, the architecture matters a lot, okay? And this is the key. When you hear people throwing teraflop numbers out there, this is the key. Now I'm gonna give you this great example that's gonna illustrate and break this down, I think, very simply. If you look at this chart, this is a comparison between Nvidia's GTX 1080 and AMD's RX Vega 64 graphics card. Now, this is a classic case, and I'm using this because it's a great illustration of what I mean in terms of efficiency and why you can't just look at the teraflop numbers to gauge performance, okay? Now, looking at this chart, and I have a link to this site in the description here, it kind of goes through the high-level differences and comparison points of the system, okay? And I want to highlight a couple of things. Generally speaking, if you look at the section there, which I have highlighted for the average performance, 1080p performance, they divide it by resolution. So the average 1080p performance, 1440p, and 4K performance, you see that the numbers are 7%, 5%, 6%. I mean, so we're looking at roughly 5% on average, right? They're pretty close, but that 5% is actually in favor of Nvidia's 1080, okay? Keep that in mind. All right, so the 1080 has slightly better performance overall, okay? But look at the recommended power supply here. And notice that the Vega 64 requires a much, much higher power supply at 645 watts compared to the 530 watts for Nvidia. That's a difference of 18% of higher power for Vega, right? Now, let's look at the specification. Remember, the 1080 has higher performance by a little bit, by 5%. But when we look at the specifications, all right, I want to point out that the TDP, now the TDP stands for the thermal design power, and it's basically a number that tells you how much heat and thus how much cooling is going to be needed, right, for this particular graphics card or chip. Right? So the higher the TDP, the more heat is going to be generated, right? And the more power, the bigger power supply you're going to need. Now, when we talk about efficiency, one of the most important metrics we talk about is performance per watt. That is the key. You want to be able to yield and generate as much performance as possible within using the smallest amount of space die size using the least amount of power and the least amount of actual hardware, right? That's efficiency. You can do more with less, okay? So these two cards are close in favoring Nvidia, but AMD requires way more power to do it. As you see, almost 300 watts compared to 180 watts, okay? That's important, okay? And then as we scroll down and we look at the graphics processor, we see the actual two different architectures. And then we see the die size. Look how much smaller the 1080 actually is. It's a much smaller chip. So again, even for the 1080 to match, you know, if you look at this on paper, the Vega 64 is just way superior, has way higher specs. So even for the 1080 to match it is a feat. And it shows you just how much more efficient that Pascal architecture is, because it's way smaller and it uses way less power. We already see that. Look at the process size, okay? The process size in nanometers indicates the size of each individual transistor on the chip. The smaller the transistor, in theory, the better, because the smaller they are in size, the more we can fit in the same amount of space, right? So you look at the fact that AMD's transistors, in this case, are actually smaller, right? So they have more. Now their die is way bigger as well. But if you look at the number of transistors, they have 12.5 billion transistors on the chip. And the Nvidia card only has 7 million, right? I'm sorry, 7 billion, right? So way less transistors. Now the transistors are like the cells in our bodies, right? They are the core pieces, right, that do the work, right, the processing work, okay? They're the building blocks, right? They're like the cells in our body. It's the best way to describe them, okay? The GTX 1080 has like almost half, right? Almost half the size, right? And then we can look at more bandwidth. You look at the numbers, again, the Vega 64 has much higher bandwidth, has a much bigger memory bus, same amount of RAM, has a much more advanced memory solution. It has way more shader units. Look at that, 4096 versus 2560. So those shader units, those are the worker units that I mentioned. When you calculate teraflops, right, you calculate the shader units and the clock speed, okay? So if you look at this without even seeing it, you know that the teraflop count is going to be much higher for the Vega 64. And if you look, sure enough, it is. So look at particularly at the FP32, right, the single precision number that's mostly used for gaming. And we see that it's 12.5 teraflops. And the 1080 is only 8.8 teraflops. That's a huge difference. That's literally 50% more teraflop, 50% higher teraflop performance in the Vega 64. Again, that's a theoretical number. But let's go back. We saw it. If we look at the actual game performance at different resolutions, they're within 6%, 7% of each other, right? They're really close. But the teraflop count is way higher in favor of AMD. The die size, the number of transistors, the number of compute units, everything on paper is way higher for AMD's card. Yet Nvidia is right there with it. So this illustrates how much more efficient Nvidia's architecture is in this case. And generally, that's been the story between those two over the most of the past decade, honestly, is that Nvidia's graphics cards have been way more efficient. Their transistors are larger, they're on a larger process node. They usually have way less transistors, and their teraflop number is generally lower. But it means so much more because they're able to achieve so much more performance with that more limited hardware. And that is the key. So when you hear that the Xbox Series X has 12 teraflops and they say that it's 2x over the Xbox One X, that's not the entire story. In fact, in actual performance, it almost certainly will perform much higher than 2x because it's using a new architecture from AMD called the RDNA. Okay, now this is going to be another video. You can kind of call it a part 2 to this. I really want to talk and delve in more to what RDNA really is and what AMD's new generation of GPUs and what it means for the next generation of consoles in particular. So that's all for now. Hopefully you were able to follow this. I have some links to a lot of these sites. If you are more privy to this stuff, you can definitely go and check it out. But again, I think that it was really enlightening, and I think that this is important for people to really understand, in order to understand what, how technology is advancing, what we can expect as technology continues to advance, and what we can expect in the next generation. And I also think it's important because a lot of people don't delve into this level and really talk about that efficiency part. They get caught up in, even the marketing people at the companies, Nvidia, AMD, they know that people aren't going to know and understand what a teraflop really is, and to understand the differences in efficiency. But hopefully you take away from here that don't take the numbers at face value. There definitely is a lot more to it to really understand what the performance is. So if you hear a system that is slightly less teraflops, if Xbox Series X is 12 teraflops and PlayStation 5 turns out to only be 10, 9, even I'm pretty sure it'll be higher than that, that doesn't tell the whole story, right? It's very possible that they still could be really close in performance. So let's keep that in mind. Thank you for watching. If you made it to this point, please subscribe to the channel, comment, let me know what you think, let me know if you learned something, let me know if it makes sense, and hopefully you stay tuned for the upcoming videos. So until then, take care. Talk to you later.